If you believe everyone deserves a place to call home, whether they live in McPherson or across the country, you can make it happen. At Housing for Good, we shine a light on housing challenges, spotlighting real people, real stories, and solutions shaping communities near and far. And with your support, we can go further in ending instability for good. Donate now at McPhersonHousingCoalition.org to help transform shelter into stability for someone, somewhere today.
Welcome to Housing for Good, a podcast dedicated to housing topics and issues affecting our communities in McPherson County and beyond. With years of experience and expertise, hosts Chris Goodson and Karolyn Moore discuss housing challenges and opportunities with other experts from a variety of housing fields.
Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of Housing for Good. I'm Karolyn, and I am here by myself. Chris has left me alone, but it'll be okay. She's on a fun trip, and so I'm happy for her about that. So I know last week she talked with Michelle Martin with the city of Salina, and they talked about a fair housing seminar that's coming up. And I just want to point that out, that is on Friday, April 24th. And so you can get a hold of the city of Salina if you're interested in attending that. And then Brush Up Mac, this is coming up for us. And we are now starting to collect volunteer applications. The homeowner application timeframe has passed. But if you want to volunteer for this Brush Up Mac on April 18, I need you to go to our website, McPhersonHousingCoalition.org, where you can get a volunteer form filled out, or you can pick one of these up in paper form at either the chamber or the senior center. And now is when we want the volunteers to get their forms in, and I need those back by April 1st so we can put together our teams. And then the other thing I wanted to point out, one thing Chris and I like to do on this podcast is let you know of situations that are happening that are making a difference for the people in the community. And my daughter sent me this. There are families in our communities making impossible choices every day between paying rent or buying shampoo, between groceries or laundry soap. This is where you come in. Life 88.5 is a Christian radio station in the Kansas City area, and they are partnering with Giving the Basics for a Dignity Drive to provide everyday essentials most of us don't think twice about. So deodorant, toilet paper, shampoo, laundry detergent, those kinds of things are not luxuries. They're something everybody needs. And this radio station is picking one day on April 7th that you can drop these items off at the Chick-fil-A that's located at Metcalf Avenue in Overland Park between 4 and 6. And if you hear this and you missed that date, just get a hold of that radio station and ask them if you're still able to bring stuff to them for that drive. And then I'll just remind you, if you're in the McPherson area, we do have the St. Anne's Episcopal Church that has a clean closet, and they distribute these kinds of items the third Friday of the month. And if you are listening from someplace where you don't know if anything like this is going on in your community, get a hold of a radio station or a church or someplace and see if you can't partner with them to hold a drive and to make a difference. Well, today's guest is Matt Lowe with the United Way Plains organization. So, Matt, welcome to the show, and introduce yourself. Tell us a little bit about your role as Director of Community Impact and what that means for the community.
Sure thing. Thank you, first of all, for having me on your show today. As you said, my name is Matt Lowe. I'm with the United Way of the Plains, Director of Community Impact. I've been with the United Way for just over 4 years. And in my role, I really wear two hats. Mm-hmm. On the one side, there is, I would say, more of your grant making, working with both funded, non-funded partners in our area to address various community needs. Mm-hmm. And then with the other hat that I wear is I'm the lead staff for the Coalition to End Homelessness in Wichita and Sedgwick County, where we work to make homelessness rare, brief, and non-reoccurring in our community.
Okay, wow, that you do have a lot on your plate with those two roles, which could be individual in and of themselves, and here they've got you doing both of them.
Yes. There are days it can be very challenging. I really love my work, though. That's what, it draws me in, and it keeps me as we say a lot of times around the United Way, it's not hard to get up and go to work in the morning. It keeps very engaged, and the work is meaningful.
Yeah, awesome. So what drew you to do work in community impact and nonprofit collaboration?
Well, to start out my career, I started out in ministry, like in church ministry, working as a youth pastor. Did that for a few years and eventually planted a church in downtown Wichita where we saw, lots of poverty and lots of people with needs. And so as I was kind of doing that, that just my heart for people grew, and it grew outside just the four walls of the church. That's where I found myself, working with the people in the community almost more so than I was preparing for the sermons and that kind of thing, that you would do at the church. And so I began working in nonprofit. I started out working, kind of falling back into the youth ministry thing, working with transition age youth, kids that were in the custody of the state of Kansas, whether it be foster care or juvenile justice, in a transitional living type of environment, and just kind of grew through that. And eventually, and I was between jobs. I had left a position working with teens. It was very difficult. And a role came open at the St. Anthony Family Shelter in Wichita. And it was a homeless shelter for families. It really combined all of my life experiences up to that point, both with youth ministry, with families. It was a Catholic organization, so it very much brought in that faith element. And so that was kind of my first introduction to really working with families or working with homeless people from a systemic type of situation. And I spent several years working with Catholic charities, short time at Humankind Ministries, and then this role came open at United Way of the Plains. And, with every step along my career, I've always looked at the impact that I can have upon a group of people. And what started out with being a group of, clients, as a case manager, as a direct care staff, as I grew and became a supervisor, I realized that I can multiply my impact. If I can take the success that I have working with people and impart that upon others, then, we can multiply the work that we begin, to do. And so, at the United Way of the Plains, I came in, to the Coalition in Homelessness, and it just really gives me a lot of opportunities to be able to bring in, some of the best practices, across the country and into our community, to work with some amazing nonprofits throughout our community, and to hopefully together make an impact for the better.
Okay, well, that sounds awesome. I have to tell you, I had a very similar path in that I was a secretary at a church, and people would come in and ask for help. And so then when I found out they had an opening here at the Housing Coalition, I kind of jumped on it. It was during COVID, and I found my hours getting cut, and so it was like, okay, I'm going to do this. So for someone unfamiliar with United Way, how do you describe the mission of the United Way of the Plains?
Well, it's really a twofold strategy to be a force for good in South Central Kansas. And it's similar as my role. I talk about wearing two hats. As a United Way as a whole, we kind of function in the same kind of way because we have those partnerships, those traditional, like what we think of, if you think of a United Way, with the taking in, money from workplaces that, want to give and want to spread that. So we have that piece of it, which is still very much a part of our mission. But over the course of years, we're seeing less and less of that taking place.
Okay.
And we've expanded to where we have actually direct services as well. So we have 13 direct services that we participate in. So we're not only taking in dollars that we're redistributing to nonprofits who are doing great work.
Yeah.
We've also got a service sector where we are stepping into that space and doing that work ourselves.
Okay. All right. So what are the biggest challenges you're seeing in our region right now when it comes to housing, poverty, and family stability?
Well, there are many. Where do you start with that? Right. First of all, not enough affordable housing.
Yep.
South Central Kansas is always known for being a relatively cheap place to live. It's very cost effective. But we're seeing that change over the course of time because of inflation, because of other things. Because as inflation drives the housing prices up, which is going to drive all of the people who have lower incomes out, right? We're seeing, the cost of living is beginning to go up, and it's really, causing a strain. Particularly, I think about on people who are living on fixed incomes. People like our seniors. We have a baby boomer generation that is, at retirement age. Many of them have already retired, and there will be many more that will continue to retire. And they're living on a fixed income. But when we have this inflation problem that we have, we see landlords that are going in and saying, realizing that they can get a lot more money for the properties that they have. So they're just not renewing leases.
Yeah.
And it's pushing, our seniors, it's pushing our lower income people into more difficult housing situations. And many of them are ending up, homeless and on the streets. Couple that with, the economic mobility for what we call our ALICE population. And it's kind of a term that we've coined, we used to call like the working poor. So it's people that are what we call asset limited, income constrained, but employed. So they have jobs.
Yeah.
Right. They're just on very low incomes. And we've found in the state of Kansas, about 35-40% of the people in Kansas are this population of people. And they're people that go to work every day, but just don't get enough of an income to be able to meet all of their basic needs of day-to-day living. Transportation, childcare, rent, utilities, food. Whenever they get their paycheck and they pay all the bills, there's not anything left at the end of the time.
Okay, that is a unique phrase that you just said, the ALICE population. I've never heard that before. So are you seeing any surprising trends or needs emerging in South Central Kansas that people may not realize? So you just touched on one. Anything else?
I don't know if they're surprising, but because like I said, we've always been a very cost-effective, a place to live. But, like I said, that inflation is just killing our Alice families. But it's also getting harder and harder to keep our youth in this area because other cities, other places, they're developing and they're taking. It's getting harder and harder to keep our talent. Like we're a great exporter of talent in Kansas, right? And so I find that I don't know if it's surprising or not, but we want to keep our talent here, and as much as we can. Those would be the two main things.
Okay. Well, and I've heard that being discussed with the city of McPherson is when we're talking about economic growth. We don't want our high school students leaving. So how do we provide them the necessary training and education for those pools of employment that are just lacking right now? So you think about the business trades and that kind of thing. That's where they've been kind of focusing on. So what makes a nonprofit partnership successful from United Way's perspective?
When we look at the people that we want to partner with or what we consider success, I mean, we're very heavy on looking at outcomes. Like is the work that you're doing moving the needle in the area that you're choosing to work in? So that's a big piece of it. But we also look at within that adaptability, being willing to adjust, to meet the current needs because we have a lot of great nonprofits again, but if we get stuck in the way that we do things, the world is consistently changing or continuously changing around us, and we have to adjust with it, and we have to adjust how we do that work. And then, just having that openness, to having, those tough conversations, willingness to make those adjustments. That's ultimately how we judge success.
My boss always says her husband tells her she didn't even know there was a box. So that out of the box thinking, we can't just keep doing it the way we've been doing it and expect something different. So how do you help nonprofits coordinate instead of compete for resources? Well,
we, regular convening around community needs. I think, at the United Way, our coalition is probably the best example of that, just because, we have this issue of homelessness in our community. Within that bucket, you could add in, rent utility assistance. You could add in how do we address families, a lot of different issues. And so we regularly try to bring nonprofits together to work together to solve those needs. All of these issues that we're facing as communities, whether it be McPherson, South Central Kansas, Wichita, or counties, whatever it may be, I mean, they are community-wide issues, and they really, we at our heart believe that it takes the community working together to solve those problems. So we regularly try to bring people together, work groups, those kinds of things to try to solve those things. We have a couple times a year, we do our funded partner celebrations, again, just bringing all the partners together just to celebrate the work. We encourage that collaboration. We often talk about it at the United Way, collaborate, not compete,
Yeah.
Right? And so that's kind of our thing. There are many other ways that the United Way supports the nonprofit ecosystem beyond just financially. So we have our Give Items of Value warehouse, where we have a relationship with Amazon, and all of the items that are returned to Amazon, they regift those to the United Way, and we have a big warehouse where we invite nonprofits to come, and they can come and shop for those items. They're all free of charge, but they can come through. They can get items for either their own nonprofit, like office chairs or whatever other supplies they may need. But many times they get things as well to then give out to their clients. It cuts down on their overhead, and it's just a way that we can support, the nonprofit community. We have our Bank On Coalition. We have VITA, tax assistance, program for low-income people. There's our 211, call center resource line for people who are trying to find resources in their communities.
Yeah.
We serve most of the state of Kansas with the exception of the Kansas City area with that. And so there's just a lot of ways that the United Way tries to give back to the community. We really, really have prided ourselves, especially over the last several years, of not having transactional relationships with the nonprofits. We really are trying to create an ecosystem, where we are seen as partners, not rivals, colleagues, not competitors.
Yeah, Chris and I, we talk about this routinely where you have organizations that are doing whatever it is they're doing, whatever service they're providing, but then periodically you'll see somebody come in that wants to take over what somebody else is doing. Like, why are you doing that? Either join them or do something different.
100%.
Is kind of, yeah. Okay, can you share a program or a partnership that has had a major impact on the community recently?
Sure. I can think of a few, actually. We had a gap in our community where we would have a lot of housing resources. And of course, we have a lot of people who need those resources, but we needed something to fill the gap, if you will, like people who would connect the resource with the person who needs it.
Yeah.
And so, a couple of years back at the United Way, we had a staff person, and she kind of managed this referral process. And she would tell me, she would say, if you could just give me a few hours a week, I bet I could go over to this homeless resource center, and I could probably house a lot of people really fast, right?
Okay.
So we piloted this thing. We call it our Housing Navigator program, and she went over and she did that and found it was very successful. So we've kind of scaled that. We currently have 3 full-time housing navigators at the United Way, as well as 2 student interns. Some of our other nonprofits, the Day Center has added a housing navigator within their program, and we have others who are adding housing navigators in their programs as well. We found that to be the game changer, beyond just having like a shelter for people to go to, which is critically important. It's life-saving to have somewhere for people to go to get out of the elements and find support. But to have the case manager, whether they're in a shelter or they're on the street, it's having that person who will walk alongside the person experiencing homelessness to overcome whatever barriers that they may have and to help them sign the lease. I've been doing this long enough. I remember the days where we'd hand people a list of, like, here, go find a unit. Let me know when you found a unit and we'll take the next step. So we're basically sending people out with no jobs, no IDs, possibly some evictions, felonies, and other things to go and try to pitch their case to a landlord to rent to them with, with all of these barriers. And so, that having that housing navigator, we've found to be game changing. Another thing I could think of is the Union Rescue Mission in Wichita. They've recently entered into a contract with the Department of Corrections, so that as men are being released, from prison, those who are at imminent risk of homelessness, they've created a whole unit, like a whole wing within their shelter, that they could take those men into a secure environment and help launch them back out into housing, as opposed to them just being dropped off in Wichita. Because we know that if a person exits incarceration to homelessness, the likelihood of them returning very quickly to incarceration is going to be very high. And then another kind of neat thing that we've done recently, as I talked about all of the work groups that we do, we're always leaning into system gaps and trying to solve problems facing people in our community. We recently, about a year or two ago, opened up a multi-agency center called Second Light. It's a phenomenal program, where people experiencing homelessness can go and they can see all of the different programs in one spot, to help overcome their needs. One of the challenges with that is, as amazing as it is that they won't work with families with minor children because there are so many. They take anybody as they come. So they're sex offenders and other kinds of people that are on the side. So they really can't. So it's not a ding on them. But the family providers came together and said, we need something like that for families. We need, where's the central access point for a family to go to who's facing housing insecurity? And so there's been some pretty amazing work with the family providers to come together through 211. And we're really creating this a really cool system where a family facing housing insecurity can call 211. They can tell them a little bit about what their needs are, and 211 can schedule an appointment for that family to meet with a housing navigator, same day, and we can work to try to resolve that family's housing crisis and keep them in their home. Amazing concept. And then right around, along that time, we also got a grant from DCF through a TANF grant that we're going to be able to use some of those funds to be able to match with that housing navigator program. I believe it's going to be a game changer when it, our community for families facing housing insecurity.
Wow, that makes me really excited. Chris has said for years that we ask people, first of all, to have no transportation, to go to all these different places to try to get the resources they need and to tell their story over and over and over. And so, it does make a difference when you have one person that you can confide in that's going to walk alongside you, be there for appointments that make you nervous or that you've never had success tackling, and then find those landlords that are willing to work with folks because they know that person or that family is working with your organization. It does make all the difference in the world. So how do you measure if these programs are actually improving lives?
Well, again, it comes back down to outcomes. It's one thing, in the nonprofit world, a lot of times we focus on outputs. We do lots of good things. We give the food box, we give the blanket, we give the thing, but we don't really know what the impact is. I think it's just a different way of thinking and thinking about outcomes. And so within our coalition to end homelessness, for example, we look at, specifically like how many people were you able to, connect or get into permanent housing? Were they able to stay there, or did they return to homelessness? I mean, ultimately that's kind of how we measure that. Did they increase their income while they were in your program? And we look at all of those things, and that's kind of how we determine if it's making a difference, regardless of which issue you're facing. Okay.
And, that ties right into a conversation that happened yesterday with South Central COC monthly call that had to do with when looking at Built for Zero. And they were saying that South Central, we're doing a really good job of getting people housed and then helping keep them housed.
Amazing.
So that goes right along with what you were saying. You can work all day to house people, but unless you give them the supports they need and the case management and those types of supports to keep them housed, we find that they cycle in and out, and that can be really just distressing. So
for sure.
What do you think are the biggest opportunities for improving community well-being in the next 5 to 10 years?
Well, I will start out with saying affordable housing. We need to invest more in affordable housing because I think that is, as we talked about inflation and all of that, it's going to continue to be a need. But, as you talk about the ability to house people and keep them housed and have them not return to homelessness, there is a group of people within our homeless services ecosystems that we are never going to reach, this functional zero metric unless we address. And there are people that have severe and persistent mental illnesses, people with severe addiction, usually co-occurring, people with severe physical disabilities. They're in our community, in Wichita, we fondly call them our hardest to engage group. We started a pilot where we developed some criteria and we would say, what does this look like? They're the people that have been housed several times. They just kind of going in and out of the system. They're in and out of jail. They're in and out of the hospitals. They're in and out of the psych hospitals. And they're what many would consider to be our bigger drains on the system. And I will often say, and it's not just myself, there are many that will say that, we're not going to reach functional zero unless we come up with a solution for those people. So there was a group that was started out of our day center, out of United Methodist Open Door, along with, some of the staff at the United Way and some others that are working in the space in the community. We picked 5 people, went through them to the point to where we would house someone and we would literally have 5 different people going in every day of the week, to try to check on the people, to help work with them on life skills, connecting them with other resources and these types of things. Many of them all of them ended up homeless again. But it was very eye-opening. We had a homeless task force in Wichita, and one day Deanne Smith, who works with United Methodist Open Door, she was sharing about this hardest to engage population in front of all of these community leaders, and she was talking about how difficult it was. And one of our county commissioners, Ryan Beatty is his name. It's like a light bulb kind of went off. Not saying he hadn't thought of this before,
Yeah.
but at least in the moment, it seemed to click. And he said something that we'd all been thinking for quite a long time. So I was just
Yeah.
glad to hear it and said out loud. He said it's as if, we're holding the homeless services system accountable to solve a problem they're not equipped to solve.
Yeah.
And I was like, that is 100% it. We can house people all day long, as you said.
Yeah.
We're very good at it. In fact, of the 3,500 people or 4,000 people we see experience homelessness in Wichita, about 80% of them self-resolve. Like they come through, they stay in a shelter, light case management, they go into housing. We can connect them with some rapid rehousing or something like that. But they go through our system and they go on with their lives and then they never return.
Yeah.
It's that smaller group of people that maybe need more permanent supportive housing. But even within that, there's a smaller group of people
Yeah.
that just need something more. And so in the next 5 to 10 years, I believe that it is imperative that communities, I think it's bigger than just Wichita, Sedgwick County, McPherson County, South Central region. I believe it's a statewide issue. As I've brought it up with other leadership in the state, we're seeing it in all the communities. I believe it's something that our state leadership very much needs to lean into if we're going to be the best Kansas we can be.
Yeah, I would second that. And, I don't think it's just a state issue. I think it's a nationwide. And actually, we've heard from people in other countries, too. Mm-hmm. It's a worldwide issue of homelessness and people being pushed into it. And so if someone is listening and they want to help, whether through volunteering, giving, or advocacy, what should they do first?
Well, check us out at www.unitedwayplains.org. There's lots of information on there on ways that you can get involved, volunteer, donate. All of our direct service links are there. Follow us on social media. We have a very active social media presence that we regularly are updating with community needs and as well as some of the amazing work that's going on in the community. For someone who wants to specifically volunteer, I recommend reaching out. Our volunteer center manager, her name's Amy Holly with United Way. She can get you connected, as well as if someone wants to give financially to our philanthropy team, Gwen Kochman. Just give us a call. Reach out. Stay engaged. The United Way of the Plains. We don't just cover Wichita. We cover much of the South Central region. There is certainly a United Way that's very much engaged in Harvey County and in this region. But get involved with United Way. That's the way to go.
We have United Way in McPherson. Okay. And so United Way is one of those programs that's nationwide, isn't it? Aren't you guys everywhere?
Yes, they're everywhere. They're like a nationwide organization that has its own local context, which I think is great because, I think our United Way national headquarters is in Alexandria, Virginia, maybe. It's like around D.C. area. And, they do tremendous work to support, but it's like they're far removed from what's going on in central Kansas. So
well, and it just goes to show that every community is so different and the needs are different and the resources need to be different. That's right. Yeah. Well, hey, thank you, Matt, so much for joining me today on Housing for Good. If you would be interested or you know someone who would be interested in being on Housing for Good, drop us a line, leave us a review. You can ask a question. And you can do all of that at Housing for Good at McPhersonHC.org. Thank you and have a great day.